So here I am at PoetryEast at the London Buddhist Centre, and we're just setting up for PoetryEast with Clive Wilmer and Michael Knott. Clive Wilmer was a friend of Tom Gunn, a good friend of Tom Gunn. He's also edited Tom Gunn's selected poems, a very interesting and annotated selected poems that really helps you with Gunn's poetry. And Michael Knott and Clive, along with August Kleinzeiler, edited this fantastic volume of letters, which is just wonderful. So we're just about to talk, I'm about to talk to Clive and Michael about Tom Gunn. It's a sort of celebration of Tom Gunn's life and work. We'll be hearing poems. I'm going to be asking questions about Gunn's life. It's going to be wonderful. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome, both of you. Very, very good to have you.
Thank you for inviting us.
No, very good. That's very good. It's interesting with Michael. Michael's writing, as I said, the writing of biography, and I assumed Michael was living in, I don't know, LA or something. And then he said, "Oh yeah, I'd love to come. I'm just living down the road." So you at least haven't had to travel very far.
No, although I did puncture my air of mystique.
Yes, it's so easy to puncture one's air of mystique. So I thought we'd start though by just plunging into a poem, because that's after all what we're focusing on this evening. But not at first one of Tom Gunn's poems, but one of Clive's poems. I've got his selected poems. I think, you've got the selected poems as well. This beautiful, wonderful copy of poems. And I thought I'd ask you to read the poem you wrote called To Tom Gunn on his 60th birthday, which I presume is a poem you wrote to Tom on his 60th birthday. I don't know, it's a title, something in the title suggested it. You and August Kleinzeiler wrote a poem for his 60th birthday, I think. Is that right? Didn't August Kleinzeiler write?
Yes, I think he did.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah. Oddly enough, because as you may have noticed, I live in England. August presented this poem to Tom on his 60th birthday at a dinner that he had. Shall I just read it or introduce it?
Well, you can either, whichever you.
Sorry, I've not got my glasses on. So this began as a sort of jeu d'esprit, just as something to amuse him on his birthday, and it sort of turned into a serious poem. I think you can still see the signs of the playfulness in it, but it was written 1989, and just the time when Tom was working on the poems that became The Man with Night Sweats. And so there was this extraordinary tragic circumstance cutting across his poetry and made it difficult to be simply playful, because I knew he was deeply involved in all that. To Tom Gunn on his 60th birthday. You won't recall them now, the burial mound, Valhalla, the dead warrior, poems which sound too much like half-cooked, over-seasoned stews of tough ingredients culled from Gunn and Hughes. Thistles, the birdies, the warriors of the north, the wound. Hard man, you read my pourings forth, gauche as they were, with such strict tolerance, such courtesy. You never looked askance at what derived from you partook of you, of what derived from you partook of truth, though twisted through the fantasies of youth. You taught me form, reminding me of sense, when rhetoric or modish violence deformed a phrase or rhythm. You deferred to nothing but economy of word. But that was not the start of it. I had, at 17, such a discerning lad, looked for your poems in the library and found The Sense of Movement by Gunn T. I read it with mixed feelings, much impressed by rigour, by the epithets that dressed your heroes for attack, more than by what I now admire as rigour in the thought. Yet doubting if such toughness was okay for arty liberals of that latter day. Then my sad captains showed me how the wise must reason toughly, since they recognise unreason in the will, desire and sleep, and know the limits of the calm they keep. Soon afterwards we met. I was 19, and still a stranger to the poetry scene. You were in London in the happy year of Talbot Road, and over pints of beer 2 or 3 nights we talked of poetry, image and metre, gossip and history. I boasted somewhat, mainly listening though. Later I realised you'd begun to go down new paths to new lines and loyalties, looser though still demanding, more at ease with what you are and how you have your say. Famous and 35, your year away from home and love gave you a second start, your learning still unfinished, like your art. Happy the man of 60, who still sees himself as learning. Streetwise Socrates, you who know nothing and have taught so much. 24 years now you have kept in touch through intermittent letters, meetings rare, and written of my debts as goods we share. I tried to imitate your mighty line, poetic hero, might have made it mine, hoping thereby to teach myself a role, like you, to manufacture my own soul. And to your new lines, tentative, explored like hands in darkness, groping word by word to touch on things that lie beyond the reach of words, and not to wrench them into speech. Now, as our century, blasé with despair, broaches its last decade, the troubled air trembles with rumour of disastrous ends. Where you live, with your family of friends, a plague rules, and it leaves you little choice but to make death your text, when to rejoice in ripeness might have suited your old age. Well, it is ripe, since only years assuage our grief, to live like you without regret, for which I honour you, still in your debt, and being in part by earlier works consoled. Those gorgeous metamorphoses, as gold, as California, your side of the range, the sand beyond it, undisturbed by change.
That's great. That's really great.
I ought to say, I mean, that was meeting Tom, that was in 1964. So, as I say in the poem, I was just a young lad, and he was already famous.
I wanted to just ask both of you, actually, something you say here. You say, I tried to imitate your mighty line, poetic hero, might have made it mine, hoping thereby to reach myself a role, like you to manufacture my own soul. So, yeah, I thought we'd start with the soul of Tom Gunn, with the soul of Tom Gunn.
Soul.
You know, perhaps he's listening now, as it were. What were you thinking of when you said manufacture my own soul?
I think nothing particularly sort of spiritual. I was just thinking of how one makes one. I mean, at the age of 19, one is sort of not quite complete yet, and how you make yourself, how you establish a poetic identity. I'm not sure it's anything I would care about very much now, because I'm not sure I entirely believe in a poetic identity, but it's what people tend to look for when they're young, I think.
But there is a sense in Tom Gunn's life that one of the things that, I've got so many things to ask you about, but one of the things that strikes me is he's a sort of heroic nihilist.
Yeah.
And in one of the letters, I can't remember which one, but he's saying, that the best poems are either from nihilists or from believers,
Yes.
not from someone that's agnostic.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether the two of you could say something about, his because that's what struck, particularly reading the letters, is a kind of heroic nihilism, a sense that life doesn't mean anything and that you have to make it. And I wondered whether that's what you were meaning about making his own soul.
I don't know if I was thinking of that or not. I'm afraid it's too long ago to remember exactly. But I know exactly what you're talking about in him. And that is a kind of heroism, if you have nothing to make that nothing worth something. So I do love that in him. Yeah.
What about you, Michael? How do you feel about Tom Gunn's soul? I thought we'd just start with something a tad metaphysical before we get to the sex, but we will get there, don't we?
Yeah, it reminds me, doing interviews for the letters and the biography as well. One of the people I spoke to was the DJ at Tom Gunn's favourite San Francisco leather bar, circa sort of 1995. The Hole in the Wall, which is still there but in a different place for when you all head out there. And I said to him, you used to see Tom on a sort of a daily basis when he was sort of in his early 70s, and he sort of cut me off and was like, yeah, he was having the best time, like the whole time, and just sort of kind of to use the cliche, living his best life. And I think that kind of comes across.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
But there is this sort of, we'll come on to it in a minute, but there's this real rigour, intellectual rigour, but also rigour about life, about meaning, about not being untruthful, about what he could ascribe to, what he couldn't. And that rigour runs right the way through the letters. With all his warmth and friendliness. He's immensely charming in the letters, isn't he?
Enormously.
Always readable, charming. He comes across as hugely good-natured. I don't know whether he was, but you've got this rigour running through it as well. And this unwillingness to be enchanted in a certain way.
Yeah. He was, just taking the other point, he was extremely charming and terrific company. And I made friends with him very quickly, and it rather surprised me that he was so easy to be friends with. He was very self-effacing, surprisingly, and courteous. But you're quite right, he didn't believe in anything. Your question about the soul, well, he didn't believe he had a soul.
And the poem sort of, I was going to say, how did you meet him? But the poem so well describes your friendship with Gunn. Michael, how did you become Gunn's biographer? How did that happen?
Wow.
Because you're not American.
No. When did it start? The first book of Tom Gunn's I read was Positives, which is a bit of an outlier for several reasons. One, it's not in the collected. Two, it's a collaboration he did with his brother, who's a photographer. And I was doing a PhD thesis at the time on collaborations between photographers and poets, and this was maybe sort of 2 years into that, and I finally had found I'd finally found a good one, and I thought I should do my due diligence and sort of read the collected as well, and then learn that I had started right in sort of the middle of his sort of experimentation between My Sad Captains and The Touch, which came out slightly after Positives. And And something about him made me want to do work on him after the thesis. And I met you in 2015, roughly.
Something like that.
I had been to Emory University in Atlanta to look at some Tom Gunn letters. Actually, no, that's a lie. I went to look at something else. I went to look at some Ted Hughes letters to a photographer, Faye Godwin, with whom he worked on Remains of Almet, another one of these sort of collaborative photo poetry books, and came across Emory had Carl Miller's papers as well, and there is say 25 letters or so from Tom Gunn to Carl, and I knew through the grapevine that you were doing the selecting poems, and I think I sent you copies.
Yes, you did, and I used them. Yeah.
And yeah, so I think I went to see you, and it sort of grew from there really, and we just you and August Kleinzahler, who's Tom's other literary executor, wanted to put the letters together and asked me aboard, and that led in turn to the biography.
Yeah.
Was that right? Did I remember?
It is right. Can I make the point? The letters are really edited by Michael. I was just a kind of advisor.
You were very good at that.
Before we argue about the letters, let's hear it. It might be time to actually hear one of Tom's. But so I thought we'd actually start with Sunlight. I thought I'd choose this because it's Tom Gunn's favourite. He said it's my favourite poem by myself. I think that's right, isn't it? That's what I've got from your annotation. So I thought we'd start with Sunlight, which is, where is Sunlight? It's quite in the middle, isn't it?
Yes, it's interesting actually, sort of fortuitously, I think fortuitously, that of course it's a sort of religious poem.
Yes, I had sort of slightly that in mind.
He kind of conceded that. He said, I'm completely unspiritual and unreligious, but I've written a religious poem. And I think that's right, yeah. Sunlight. Some things by their affinity light's token are more than shown. Steel glitters from a track. Small glinting scoops after a wave has broken dimple the water in its draining back. Water, glass, metal match light in their raptures, flashing their many answers to the one. What captures light belongs to what it captures, the whole side of a world facing the sun, returned to woo the original perfection, giving itself to what created it, and wearing green in sign of its subjection. It is as if the sun were infinite. But angry flaws are swallowed by the distance. It varies, moves. Its concentrated fires are slowly dying. The image of persistence is an image only of our own desires. Desires and knowledge touch without relating. The system of which sun and we are part is both imperfect and deteriorating, and yet the sun outlasts us at the heart. Great seedbed, yellow centre of the flower, flower on its own without a root or stem, giving all colour and all shape their power, still recreating in defining them. Enable us, altering like you, to enter your passionless love, impartial but intense, and kindle an acceptance round your centre, petals of light, lost in your innocence.
I mean, it is a praise poem to the sun, isn't it? So it's an unusual poem, Gunn.
Yeah.
And that word innocence is a key word in Gunn.
Yeah. Because it's the last poem in Gunn's collection, Moly, which is a book about innocence, essentially. Trying to recover innocence, a kind of paradisal quality that we have inside us, or as he believes we do. Yeah.
That's good. Have you got any thoughts about this poem, Michael?
Yeah, he wrote this. It was one of the earlier Moly ones. It was sort of 67, 68, when he was still sort of going back and forth a little bit between England and America. So he'd have these sort of. I think I'm maybe thinking of From the Wave, where he watches the surfers, which he watched on Ocean Beach, out in San Francisco, and the idea stuck with him. But he actually wrote the poem around his aunt's table in Snodland, and you have sort of the fall. You have that sort of English-American thing happening, and they're all. He has to sort of step away a little bit from his scene itself and sort of reflect on that. I think there's something similar happened with Sunlight. Did he go to? There was the human being, wasn't there? Did he go to the one of the human beings in Golden Gate Park, sort of 1967? Oh, there were chants to the song with Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder.
Yeah.
I think he might have been among that.
He was,
sort of thing.
I suppose partly it's just a sort of, moving from England and from living in Hampstead, coming to the sun of California.
Absolutely.
And sunlight is right everywhere in the letters, and a love of light, and
And that particular book, Moly, I mean, when it came out, the cover was all yellow. Which was Gunn's choosing that it should be. It was a book about the sun. And because it's a very kind of, I suppose looking back at it now, you can see it's a sort of hippie thing in a way.
Right,
It's very 1960s. But the best of that, I think. It's quite profound in a way. I mean, what you were saying about his nihilism is in that poem, and yet it's sort of defeated by the adoration of the sun. Yeah.
He's not a grim nihilist, is he?
No.
He's a heroic nihilist in a way.
Yes, I think heroic is the right word. I mean, I think in the poem of mine I read at the beginning, I talked about him as my hero, and there's several reasons why I did that. One is, of course, that he writes about heroism a great deal. And he was, in my adolescent way, my hero. But he kind of remains my hero because he lived his life in a way that I think is admirable and possibly helped me to live mine.
So now we've touched it, let's look at his life. And I thought in a way I want to take the poems a bit backwards, but I thought we'd actually look at his life by starting with this wonderful tragic poem, The Gas Poker, which was in the last collection, Boss Cupid, which really seems that he spent his life waiting to write. But it's, perhaps get you to read it first, and Clive, and then we'll talk about it. But it really describes the event, it seems to me, in Gunn's life.
I don't know, some of you are quite a lot younger than me. You may not know what a gas poker is.
And
I'm going to tell you, it was a thing used for lighting a cold fire. Plugged it into the wall to get gas. Put the gas under the fire, under the coal. Lit the gas, and the gas lit the fire. It was a very convenient tool. But of course, it was also a tool which gave you easy access to gas. And it was used, in this particular case, for committing suicide. And so, well, You want me to read the poem without
Yes.
explaining?
Yeah, let's read the poem first.
No,
Then
I think you need to know that.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
48 years ago, can it be 48 since then? They forced the door which she had barricaded with a full bureau's weight, lest anyone find, as they did, what she had blocked it for. She had blocked the doorway so to keep the children out. In her red dressing gown she wrote notes, all night busy, pushing the things about, thinking till she was dizzy, before she had lain down. The children went to and fro on the harsh winter lawn, repeating their lament, a burden to each other in the December dawn, elder and younger brother, till they knew what it meant, knew all there was to know. Coming back off the grass to the room of her release, they who had been her treasures knew to turn off the gas, take the appropriate measures, telephone the police. One image from the flow sticks in the stubborn mind, a sort of backwards flute. The poker that she held up breathed from the holes aligned into her mouth, till filled up by its music. She was mute.
It's an unbearably sad poem. Perhaps you tell us more about, it's a defining event, isn't it,
In his life.
in Gunn's life?
Yeah, yeah. He was 14 when his mother killed herself, and he found the body. An absolutely unbelievably traumatic experience, one would think. And well, it's talking about how sort of I still am rather a hero worshipper of Tom Gunn, that somebody should have made such a life for himself out of such a grim experience seems to me extraordinary.
Yes, indeed.
You wouldn't be surprised if his whole life had been ruined by it. Absolutely stunning. He said about this poem that it was something he wanted to. He was an old man when he wrote this poem. I can't remember exactly how old, but he said that he wanted to write about it all his life and hadn't been able to, and for obvious reasons hadn't been able to. It was too close to it, too painful, whatever it was. And it suddenly occurred to him in the 1990s, I think it was, and he wrote it, that there was a way of doing it he hadn't thought of, which he found in a poem by Thomas Hardy. And Thomas Hardy takes a painful incident from his life and tells it in the third person. And so in the poem, it's the children did this and that. He means himself and his brother. And somehow that impersonalizing or depersonalizing of the story makes it all the more moving. It's almost as if he hadn't been there and was just an eye recording it. I see Marge, who knew Tom well when he was young, nodding to what I'm saying, which is interesting.
And perhaps say something about his relationship with his brother as well, because they were very close, weren't they? As you said, Michael, they produced a book together. Anders was a photographer. The last letter, I think, in the book is to Anders, which is very, even a valedictory letter, it feels like. I wonder what was that relationship like between Anders and Tom?
Strong. It was, although this event sort of obviously changed their relationship as well, insofar as they stayed living in the house for another half a year or so under the care of one of their older cousins. Then it was decided that Tom would move in with family friends nearby Therese Magor, her husband, and 2 sons who went to the same school as Gunn and Hampstead. But Anne went to live with their father and his new wife in Chelsea. So, I mean, he says somewhere in the letters after Anne comes to San Francisco in the 1980s, he's like, we got on very well, but bearing in mind we haven't spent more than, say, 2 or 3 weeks together since we were in our early teenage years. And when you think about sort of how often they were sort of, not only did he lose his mother, but they sort of lost each other a little bit as well for the rest of their childhood. Yeah. And I think that made, and then when Tom left to America, obviously he only saw Anne very occasionally and not for very long. So yeah, it's hard to sort of, I think there was a little bit of strain there sometimes. But
And one of the questions I was thinking for you, Clive, is, I mean, I think it is a remarkable poem to have ever written, and it's very, very striking that it's so late in his life. I mean, even the letters, there's very, very few references to his mother, a few, but very, very few. There's no long letter about explaining it or anything like that. And then of course it brings to mind Sylvia Plath, and Gunn talks about Plath in the letters. And you sort of want to think, why didn't Tom Gunn end up like Sylvia Plath? Why? What is this thing of reticence that runs through Gunn's work and life so much? He was even uneasy about Plath's writing. But Plath's father effectively committed suicide in an extremely complex and distorting way for his daughter. I mean, they think now that he was depressed, very, very severely depressed. But it could so easily have been the same story.
Yeah, I mean, I think he must have. He didn't like Sylvia Plath's poetry, put simply.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you can sort of see why, because she made a career out of her own death, as it were, which I think he rather resented. That he had behaved stoically and had survived it, and she couldn't do that. So I think on a personal level, he rather disliked her, and he disliked that kind of writing, in which the self is kind of spilled out, guts are spilled out, as people say. But I also think beneath that it must have reminded him of his mother's death when she died. Because so it must have been painful to him.
You include in the annotations a diary entry from Gunn at the time, which is again extraordinarily painful to read.
It is, and it's a really wonderful piece of writing. A boy of 14, with this curiously objective account of her death. Though it's very painful, and you can feel his pain. But it's, I mean, that's what he's really good at, I suppose. You see it in the poem The Gas Poker. Is taking something which perhaps is very personal and laying it out so that we can contemplate it. He's not hanging on to it as a person. He's issuing it to the world in some way.
Yeah. And he seems to me very strict about that. I don't know, there's no indulgence in him.
No.
Reading the letter, I never felt that he was sorry for himself. I never felt he was indulgent in any way.
No, absolutely not. And he greatly disliked self-indulgence in writing.
Right. Yeah. You got anything?
The third person is interesting in the poem. The death was reported in some of the local papers about a week afterwards, because it was shortly after Christmas, and then you had the New Year break, so the news didn't sort of come out in the weekly local. I think it was Ham and High and one or two of the other Camden ones, and it sort of relates a little bit of detail about Charlotte's relationship with her second husband, Ron Hyde, who was the news editor of the Evening Standard, where Gunn was the editor, so everybody knew everyone quite intensely. One of the reports ends with the line that some children found her body, and I always wondered whether he would have read that. I didn't come across any evidence that he did. That if they took the local paper, he would have read this report about what happened to his mum, and seeing him in it in the third person would have been sort of, I don't know, I can't really imagine what that must have felt like on top of everything else. But
in a sense, sorry to interrupt you, but he reproduces that in the poem.
So I wondered whether, I don't know, there was some memory of that in there, whether he'd read it, but like I say, I never, in the notebooks or anything, I never came across.
He himself was very close to his mother, wasn't he? He was very distant to his father, doesn't seem to like his father really. He was very close to his mother, at least.
He adored his mother, and disliked his father. I mean, Ander thinks that he was a bit unjust to his father.
Oh, really?
He said that to you?
Time is moving on, but I definitely want to make sure we have at least 2 more poems before we have a cup of tea. So let's now go back to an early great poem, Tamer and Hawk. And there's, let's talk about Tamer and Hawk, and then on the movie let's have a cup of tea. So let's do Tamer and Hawk first. Surely there's so many poems I like, how long have you got? You want
So this is from Fighting Terms, Tom's first book. And it takes a rather sort of Elizabethan metaphor as its foundation, the relationship between lovers, as being like that between a falcon and its tamer. Tamer and Hawk. I thought I was so tough, but gentle that your hands cannot be quick enough to fly for you and show that when I go at your commands. Even in flight above, I am no longer free. You sealed me with your love. I am blind to other birds. The habit of your words has hooded me. As formerly, I wheel, I hover and I twist, but only want the feel in my possessive thought of catcher and of court upon your wrist. You but half civilize, taming me in this way. Through having only eyes for you I fear to lose. I lose to keep and choose, tamer as prey.
Who is this about?
Sorry?
Who is this about?
It's about Mike Kitay, who was his lover, and with whom he lived actually for the rest of his life.
Another sort of hero it feels to me reading the letters, and Mike is another hero in that life, in his own way.
Yeah. Well, Mike is a wonderfully nice man. I don't know well enough to say whether he's a hero, but they must have been a lovely couple. Again, Margie knew them together.
I introduced them.
Oh, did you? That's great. I thought, I wondered whether you'd read that first verse again.
Third verse.
That first verse again.
Yes. I thought I was so tough, but gentle that your hands cannot be quick enough to fly for you and show that when I go at your commands.
I just thought that's like for me that's like an exquisite expression of Gunn's voice.
Yeah.
It's so classic. It's so beautifully balanced. It's so elegant without being prissy or dainty. There's no daintiness ever in Gunn.
No.
It's got this toughness, but it's not machismo. I just thought that's a wonderful. The whole poem is, of course, but
it's very beautiful musically, I think. Yeah. And it's something that preoccupies me about Gunn. It's rooted in Renaissance poetry. Either the form, that kind of song, the image of the hawk, and so on and so forth. It could be by Thomas Campion or somebody like that. Yet it's a completely modern poem. And he seems to be able to take conventions and so on from the past and simply put them to his own use. And there are many, many poems that do that. And this is the earliest, which I think makes that sort of impact. I mean, this was written when he was about 21.
Right, yeah.
It's astonishing.
I mean, it's incredibly mature voice for a 21-year-old.
Yeah.
So assured, without being sort of... Sometimes when things are assured, they get sort of, I don't know, didactic or a bit sort of clumsy in a way. It's this perfect mixture of elegance and refinement, but also this incredible toughness which runs through the whole poems.
Yeah.
Have you got anything you would like to add, Michael, on Tamer and Hawk?
Yeah, it was written at a sort of a difficult emotional time for Tom, because he had only just met Mike. Like, this is not a poem that he wrote sort of even a year into this this great love, but he was during the Easter holiday at university. Mike still technically had a girlfriend from America who had come to see him slightly without him knowing that this was going to happen, but it was a whole thing. So they disappear off to Spain together, and Tom is left being a bit like, what's happening?
We've all been there.
So he spends the Easter break with his aunts in Kent, which is not where he wants to be. And he wrote like 4 or 5 poems, of which one was Tamer and Hawk, because he's so in this and he's so worried that what is going on. And I just think, it's the classic example of gun control, which Mike always thought was a bit of an oxymoron. But at a young age and under sort of a remarkable sort of emotional duress, it's unbelievable, really.
And incredibly erotic. I want to sort of say more about that in the second half. But before we have a break, let's look at On the Move, because such an important poem. There's a lot said, but there's also almost too much to say about almost everyone. But let's hear On the Move, which is who was saying to they studied at a school, and so such a well-known poem. Weirdly, quite often now people seem to print it without the first verse, which I'm
really?
sure. Yeah, I've seen it on the dreaded Facebook. Don't worry, you're quite safe. It is.
Pages are stuck together. On the Move. The blue jay scuffling in the bushes follows some hidden purpose, and the gust of birds that spurts across the field, the wheeling swallows, has nested in the trees and undergrowth. Seeking their instinct or their poise, or both, one moves with an uncertain violence under the dust thrown by a baffled sense or the dull thunder of approximate words. On motorcycles up the road they come, small, black, as flies hanging in heat, the boys, until the distance throws them forth, their hum bulging to thunder, held by calf and thigh. In goggles donned in personality, in gleaming jackets trophied with the dust, they strap in doubt by hiding it robust, and almost hear a meaning in their noise. Exact conclusion of their hardiness has no shape yet, but from known whereabouts they ride, direction where the tires press. They scare a flight of birds across the field. much that is natural to the will must yield. Men manufacture both machine and soul, and use what they imperfectly control to dare a future from the taken roots. It is a part solution, after all. One is not necessarily discord on earth, or damned because, half animal, one lacks direct instinct, because one wakes afloat on movement that divides and breaks. One joins the movement in a valueless world, choosing it, till, both hurler and the hurled, one moves as well, always toward. A minute holds them who have come to go. The self-defined, astride the created will, they burst away. The towns they travel through, a home for neither bird nor holiness, for birds and saints complete their purposes. At worst, one is in motion, and at best, reaching no absolute in which to rest, one is always nearer by not keeping still.
I mean, this is a wonderful poem, and the thing that strikes me about this poem, about many Gunn poems, is that in some ways they seem straightforward. He's never difficult in a particular way. It's always clear what he's talking about. He's not like Wallace Stevens, who you don't have no idea. Like, are we walking down the street? What are we doing here? You have no idea. Is it a dream? With Gunn, you always know what he's talking about. But actually, it's rather difficult as well, in another sense. I wonder whether you might say something about that and something a bit more about this poem.
I'm not sure I can say very much about that, but it was certainly my experience of reading it.
Right, yeah.
I would say was, when I first read it. And I suppose one of the things is it's about a lot of things at once. I mean, it's partly about language, and you don't notice that particularly because it's so obviously about motorcyclists.
Right, yeah.
But the motorcyclists are kind of what used to be called conceit. They're sort of an extended metaphor. And it's very much written in a sort of English metaphysical mode. It's like John Donne comparing his love to something utterly improbable. Soul being compared to a motorbike. Oh yeah? Obviously. So somebody I think said about Donne, the trick is to create an improbable comparison and then somehow prove it. Use the poem to sort of demonstrate that it is so, however unlikely it might seem. So I think there's a lot of that in the poem. It's another example of how, I don't think he modernizes, but he takes something from the past and uses it for his own purposes in a sort of uniquely modern way.
Yes, yeah. But he doesn't modernize it, does it? It's not like he sort of, I don't know, there's not so much poetry now. There's got lots of bits and bobs in it. It's got all sorts of brown names, Marmite, and but he doesn't modernise in a sort of trivial way. I suppose.
He didn't really believe in the past in poetry. Really, he thought somewhere or other he says, I thought, and talking about his youth, I thought of Donne and Shakespeare as my contemporaries, and I think that's partly accounts for what you're saying. They're talking about the same world that he lives in, and using roughly the same language.
Yeah. Because you've got that sort of beautiful classic sound.
Yeah.
There's no disruption in that. It's not. No. It's not trying to disrupt. Later on, I might compare him with James Merrill, which is Merrill does the opposite. He uses pentameter and formal means like Gunn and as well as Gunn, but much more in a postmodern sort of way.
Yes, it sort of advertises itself.
Yes.
You're meant to notice.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas you're not meant to notice with Gunn.
Yes, that's right.
It's the structure of the poem, that's it, and it's there, but you don't particularly feel your attention is being drawn to it.
No, that's right. Mike, have you got anything to add to There's so much we could say about it.
Yeah, I mean, biographically, it's a sort of interesting time for him. just moved to California. He's working with Ivor Winters at Stanford, sort of trying to learn from sort of Wintersian ideas, but like not too much. And he's quite a quick turnaround from sort of first idea to final draft, maybe 2 months. There's a complete run of the drafts. I think it's in the poetry collection at the university at Buffalo. It's interesting what you say about it being very modern. Some of the earlier drafts refer to Percival and the Knights, which he sort of last quite a long time in the revision scheme, but are ultimately removed. So there's no real methodological storytelling structure in there as we read it now, but it may have been underpinned by that earlier.
It's extraordinary how it comes together in those drafts. I mean, you can't really see a good poem in it for ages.
I mean, Gunn himself was very pleased with it at first, wasn't he? But later became quite critical of it.
Yes.
Rather brilliantly. You know, he's very rigorous about his own work as well.
He certainly thought that one in the final line was sort of separated. You know, one must.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. And wasn't sure about the last line.
No, one is always nearer by not keeping still. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things about it, he got fed up with things that were famous. I think. I don't think he was always fair on himself in a way.
Right, yeah.
You know, because it's a wonderful poem.
Yeah, it is.
But he was disposed to disparage it a great deal, and I knew.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because it was so famous, really.
I think so, probably. But what he disliked, I understand this actually as a poem myself, he disliked the neatness. You know, he disliked the feeling that it's a shut box. And wanted poems, he thought poems were alive if they weren't quite perfect, I think.
That's it, yeah. So I thought we'd start this second half with another, wonderful poem. I mean, do get the selected poems with Clive's annotations. These poems need to be read and reread. Poetry is the only form that's written to be reread, you could say. That's you won't be able to just take them in one reading like this. I keep going back to Gunn, and I keep getting more and more from him. But let's start with the allegory of the Wolf Boy. I can't remember which collection this is in, actually.
It's a sense of movement.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And somebody was asking me, when do we get to sex? And I said, this is where we been a lot of advertising.
Still in disguise.
Yeah, one of the guys.
The allegory of the wolf boy. The causes are in time. Only their issue is bodied in the flesh, the finite powers. And how to guess he hides in that firm tissue seeds of division? At tennis and at tea upon the gentle lawn, he is not ours, but plays us in a sad duplicity. Tonight the boy, still boy, open and blonde, breaks from the house, wedges his clothes between two moulded garden urns, and goes beyond his understanding through the dark and dust, fields of sharp stubble abandoned by machine, to the whirring enmity of insect lust. As yet ungolden in the dense hot night, the spikes enter his feet. He seeks the moon, which with a touch of its infertile light shall loose desires hoarded against his will by the long urging of the afternoon. Slowly the hard rim shifts above the hill. White in the beam, he stops, faces it square, and the same instant leaping from the ground, feels the familiar itch of close dark hair. Then clean exception to the natural laws, only to instinct and the moon being bound, drops on 4 feet. Yet he has bleeding paws.
Tell us something more about this remarkable poem. In a way, it opens our whole discussion about Gunn and his sexuality.
Yeah.
A very important theme of the whole of his work.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously written from a poem where you have to keep your sexuality secret. And it's interesting, it's an allegory of a wolf boy. The wolf boy is a gay young man. But it's an allegory that I think you're sort of not meant to understand the allegory if you're the wrong person.
Right, I see.
You know, if you're the person who doesn't tolerate these things, you don't understand the allegory. So it's not a conventional allegory in that sense. Tom didn't like this poem very much, funnily enough. I never quite understood. I think he thought it was too, I was talking earlier about neatness. I think he thought it was a bit too clever, too neat. Don't know.
And yet, it begins, and later on as he writes, he becomes obviously much more open about his sexuality, and eventually writes some, I think some of the greatest elegies, modern elegies. We're going to hear one of those. I wonder, it'd be worth exploring what that was like for him. What we would now sort of call coming out.
I think Michael's the person who can answer that better because you've written about this.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote the Allegory of the Wolf Boy when he was teaching in Texas. So after a year at Stanford, he got a 1-year teaching job in San Antonio, which was a little bit of a culture shock, to join Mike, who was in his last year in the Air Force. And it was very different to being in California. Mike obviously being on base for the Air Force. Tom was all of a sudden forced to, live. He says somewhere in one of the letters, I think it's to Tony White, he says, it's about a gay man, but really it's about anyone who isn't living the kind of life they want to live. For him, obviously, that was a particular life. But there was a danger at the end of that year in Texas when Mike was reported to the Air Force for engaging in homosexual activity. And there was a whole investigation, and Tom, through his friend Tony White, asked Margie, who's in the audience, to write a letter to say that she was Mike's a girlfriend while he was in Oakland as a kind of a cover. And then when Tom was interviewed as part of the investigation, he was living with Mike at this point, and Mike loves telling this story, but he said, Tom said something like, Mike couldn't possibly be a gay, because I would know because I live in he tells it a lot better than I do. But this was the sort of atmosphere that he had to live in very shortly after he just had a sort of a taste of California and San Francisco, even as early as 1954, 55. And Allegory was one of very few poems he wrote that year, in part because he was teaching a lot, and he didn't have the mental space to really write poems. But I always thought it was interesting that this was the one idea that got through to being written.
The other thing that's just yes, no, it does. But the other thing it's interesting, sort of Gunn's relationship to homosexuality. Like there's letters in which he writes to Michael Schmidt, the editor of Cocknet and PM Review. He complained, sort of talking about somebody who'd complained about the use of the word gay, and him, and Gunn really takes Mike Schmidt to task about that.
Yeah.
But there's another letter where he writes very carefully to Donald Davey, who's got quite a different, sense of that. He's very gentlemanly in relationship. He doesn't feel like a campaigner quite, although I know he also was.
His relationship with Davey is an important relationship. I think they were not close friends, but good friends. And he had an enormous respect for Davey's literary judgment. And I think he tolerated things in Davey that he wouldn't really have tolerated in other people.
Right.
Because Davey was unbelievably homophobic.
Was it?
But also Davey also felt the same about Tom. I mean, he was very fond of Tom. And therefore sort of went overboard to try and be understanding about his homosexuality. So it's a really odd relationship, but an interesting one. I think very sort of productive relationship. They brought the best out of one another. So, I knew Davey quite well as well. And I kind of saw this happen.
And wasn't that also the case with Ivor Winters? Winters would have been very, very unhappy with Gunn's sexuality.
Yeah, he would have. He would have been unhappy with it. Very late meeting I had with Tom, he talked about that a bit. He said he thought that Winters realised by the time he died that Tom was gay, and it made him feel very unhappy. And there is a very notable letter of Winters's where he tells Gunn that his poems are no good. It's rather shocking because he kind of nurtured Gunn and was a very understanding critic. And he thought that probably arose from Winters's realisation that he was gay. It's rather sad, really.
Yeah, very sad.
Yeah.
And reading the letters and the poems, there is sex everywhere, isn't there? When I read the letters, I couldn't decide what to be more jealous of: his sex life, frankly, his drug taking. He had incredible amounts of drugs, which he seemed to have loved, and there's not a single complaint. Surely there's something bad about this. Masses of sex, masses of drugs, wonderful. I couldn't decide which to be most jealous of. As a Buddhist, of course, I have no interest in sex and drugs at all, and I never have. And it's the poetry and the rhyme, especially, that attract me. But you can't help. There is sex everywhere. We'll come on to considering the snail in a moment. But I was feeling that, that he's the most erotic poet.
Yeah.
But not erotic in the silly sense. Eros has been sort of trivialised into sort of silly thing. But this sort of deep sense of eros, which is almost Greek. It's sort of to do with beauty. It's to do with a kind of coming to terms with a certain sort of animality, even rejoicing in that. But sex is everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think. I don't quite know how to put this, but if you take a poem like "On the Move," for instance, which is really kind of philosophical poem, but it's rooted in desire for these young tearaways that the poem represents, and you could tell from the way they're described that it has erotic origins as a poem. Yeah, I don't quite. Well, we'll come to considering the Snail in a minute. I want you to talk about that.
I don't think I dare.
Show me the dirty bits.
You need a bullies to show you the dirty bits. Yeah, that's some of my friends worry about. I mean, the other thing I wanted to mention is in the letters. Try to see what you think about this, Michael, but and Clive. I did. By the time he's 67 and writing quite, saucy letters, it starts to feel a bit infantile. His preoccupation with sex. For me, in the letters, that was the first time, but. It is something one should get over, is it not?
I don't know what you mean by something there. I think that's true, actually. I mean, obviously, one of the things that was very important for him is something found himself in a position where he could actually talk about sex openly, which hadn't happened till what? I must have been in his 50s, really. Right. So he said, as he said somewhere, it gave him a whole new range of subject matter as a poet. So yeah, I guess he was a bit silly about it. He didn't mind being silly. He liked play. I was going to say something else, actually, just slightly going back in this discussion. It's terrific looking around this audience and seeing so many different ages in the audience. Something that strikes me as somebody of some antiquity now. But when I first read Gunn, I had no idea that he was gay. It seems inconceivable now that I could ever not have realised, particularly as someone who loved his poetry. But I didn't know. I don't know if anybody else had that experience. We are of an age. So I don't know how I read On the Move quite without noticing. But I guess people didn't talk about homosexuality.
No.
So I didn't know what it was at the age of 16 or 17, whatever I was. Yeah.
Michael, do you have any? Yeah. You must have written in your biography a lot about leather bars and so. Yes. We've all written a lot about leather bars.
A lot is an understatement.
It's a biography of a poet that's sort of masquerading as a sort of cultural history of Folsom Street from about 1961 to the present. But it's interesting what you say about a play, because Tom took, I know this is going to sound strange, but Tom took a play very seriously, and there's a nice, I don't know if it's in the letters or not, but he talks about going to the street affairs that were often on in San Francisco. Obviously, Folsom Street Fair is the biggest, and there were one or two others he went to in the neighbourhood. And he says to one of his correspondents, he said, I sort of like to try to bring a sense of that sort of holiday into everyday life as well, where you just sort of and it's in the poem At the Barriers as well, where he's sort of, we all are just, everyone's just out in the street having a chat to all sorts of random people, and everyone's kind of, there's that great sense of togetherness in a spirit of the play as well. I think that's sort of a lot of the energy, certainly in the late poems, once he was able to write more openly. I think that really comes out.
Yes, indeed. Let's have Considering the Snail. We'll get to
So this is one of the poems, one of the early poems written in the metre he calls syllabics, which is, in case you don't know, a way of writing where you count the syllables rather than counting the stresses. And it's, in effect, in terms of English metre, it's rhythmically more or less the same thing as free verse, except it's much more organised than free verse.
it creates these very unusual line breaks, and then important line breaks.
Yeah. So it was a way of writing in poetry as disciplined as he had been writing it all along, but getting a more sort of natural movement, more like the movement of speech. Or even in some cases, I think, like the movement of prose. Considering the snail. The snail pushes through a green night, for the grass is heavy with water, and meets over the bright path he makes, where rain has darkened the earth's dark. He moves in a wood of desire, pale antlers barely stirring as he hunts. I cannot tell what power is at work, drenched there with purpose, knowing nothing. What is a snail's fury? All I think is that if later I parted the blades above the tunnel and saw the thin trail of broken white across litter, I would never have imagined the slow passion to that deliberate progress.
It's that slow passion, isn't it?
Slow passion and desire, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's like a cruising poem as well. The what is it, the white across the litter. We know how explicit do we want to be. It seems like a cruising poem in some ways.
Yeah.
But it's also a remarkable poem about a snail.
It is.
You think of it as one of Gunn's greatest poems?
I do, yes.
Why is that?
I don't know. I can't really answer. I mean, it's one of the ones I just go back to again and again. I think it's very profound and very beautiful. And I love the sort of tentative movement of it. That you read it and you don't quite know where it's going. I find it very moving. I'm sorry I'm not being very articulate about it. Do you like it?
I do, yeah, very much. Yeah. It's one of the ones I would go back to again and again.
Yeah. I know it off by heart and I sort of say it to myself quite often.
I do. Yeah. I mean, is it true that he started writing in syllabics to get out of writing in metre?
Well, that's what he said.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had a disagreement with him about one aspect. He said he did it was a way of learning to write free verse. And so once he learned to write free verse, he gave up syllabics. I personally like syllabics for themselves, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I like a lot of the free verse, I'm not saying I don't. But I really think this little set of syllabics in My Sad Captain, I think it's a stunning little collection of poems. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he does things in Considering the Snail and My Sad Captains in that form that he, not much of his free verse really gets near. I know we both value a touch very highly.
Extremely highly.
But yeah, when he starts the experiments, I think he wrote Considering the Snail and My Sad Captains around the same time, and maybe it's because he's still writing iambics out of himself that it still has, and he uses off rhymes at the end of the line, so it's still that structure as well. And I wonder, just with that, I don't want to say scaffolding because it's not really, but he manages to do something that he always kind of said he was looking to do throughout his life, and sort of get the. You talk about it in your Paris Review interview with him, where he's talking about the poetry of the past and the poetry of the present from Lawrence.
Yeah.
Trying to find a line that can actually do both things at the same time. He kind of gets near it occasionally, I think.
Yes.
What do you make? Because this is where I might start to sort of disagree a bit, because that he reads that he read a Lawrence article, doesn't it?
Yes.
Where Lawrence is basically saying that iambic pentameter is a great form for poetry about the past, and free verse is a form about poetry of the present. And I just don't agree. James Merrill at the same time was proving that wrong.
Yeah.
Merrill manages to use highly formal verse,
Yeah.
but doesn't feel anything like the past.
Yeah.
It just seemed odd to me that Gunn can be so captured by a theory there. Because touch aside, I think the free verse is weaker generally.
It's weak.
Weaker.
Yeah.
I mean,
it
it's like, but if only I could write it, but it's weaker, I think.
Yeah, generally, yeah. Well, I personally, I think that the reason he liked that in Lawrence, or why he took it on, was because he found it in himself. I mean, these syllabic poems, they're all about little moments of perception. And the way they're shaped, you don't know where the poem's going. And in fact, often the poems refer to that very fact. I mean, he doesn't know where this snail, ultimately what it's up to, where it's going. And the line end is tentative. He always has weak line endings, so you sort of hover at the end of the line, uncertain how to continue. And that's a very important part of his writing, I think, but it's not the only thing. And what he feels, I think, about metrical poems is that they're reflective. I think that's what he means by the past. I don't think he means anything to do with tradition or anything like that, but that when you write in metre, you're not trying to evoke the thing happening, you're trying to think about the thing.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So it's a reflective thing, you're looking back on it.
Right, I see.
Whereas in syllabic poems, you have an odd sense that the thing is happening before your eyes now, or before your senses now.
I mean, I wanted to test you both on this as well, because it was great having a poet that's dead, because I can criticise him. And I don't know whether you've read Clive James's The Fire of Joy. James is a wonderful idiosyncratic critic, very much, anyway. He says Tom Gunn wrote some tremendous poems early on, and some poems almost equally tremendous in the last phase of his life. Unfortunately, there was a long stretch in the middle, time spent mainly in America, where his poems weren't tremendous at all. I wondered what you make of James then.
Well, I think some of his weakest poems are in the books Jack Straw's Castle and Passages of Joy, which I don't mean those are bad books, there are very good things in those books. But I think some of his weakest poems are in those books. So there is a loss of impetus, I think, in the middle. What I don't agree with is, I mean, the period he's talking about includes Moley, which I think is his best book. I mean, I think behind it, there's this odd feeling, or odd assumption, that good poetry has to come out of unhappiness.
Yes, yeah.
And he had problems as a young man. And in the later poems, he's lamenting deaths. And so those poems are, in some sense of the word, unhappy. In the middle period, he's just enjoying life a lot. You're not allowed to write about enjoying life.
He's not in England.
No, the weather's too awful. I think that's very important, though. I think that's right. Because it's somewhere hovering behind the critiques of Gunn in this middle period. And I think there is something in that critique, but hovering behind it is this guy's having too much fun.
Yeah.
He's enjoying sex too much. He's enjoying drugs too much. He's just having too much fun to be a respectable poet. And also he's in America, and that's already,
that's a bad mark against him.
Yes, it's sort of it's bad marketing. How much was the fact that he went to America, do you think, part of the critique?
I'm puzzled by that too, because people say that what's wrong with those, as Clive James does, is that he was in America. The poems are too American. I don't know why being too American is a bad thing, but it seems to be. But actually, he'd been in America quite a long time when he wrote those poems. I mean, On the Moon was written in America.
Right, yeah.
So I think it's nonsense.
Do you think it's nonsense as well, Michael?
Yes.
It's true for nonsense.
I think I mean, it sounds like Clive James is sort of quoting what Tom called the Alvarez theory, which was sort of he never quite recaptured what he was up to in Fighting Terms. And I mean, when Alvarez reviewed the collected poems in the New Yorker in 1994, that's his argument. And I don't know, it's just very difficult to, even if you would pick one other book, you'd probably pick Moley as an example of how sort of wrong that theory is. And I think Tom sort of ended up rolling his eyes about it at the end. Lord, what can you do?
Well, he doesn't seem to be that bothered about being famous, is he? I mean, not from the letters anyway.
No, he didn't. He wasn't bothered by it at all, actually. I think I told this story, I think, in my introduction, that we had a conversation once in which I said that I thought his publishers were treating him badly. Too complicated to explain, but I thought that they didn't give him sufficient publicity and sufficient promotion. And he said, I think I'm famous enough. It's very typical.
Right. Yeah. So listen, there's so many other poems, but I want to make sure we go into this. The book that captured me first of all was The Man with Nice Sweats. I remember it coming out
93.
93.
92.
92. I'd not long been ordained. I remember there being a large article about it, I think, in The Guardian. What you've got, not the whole book, but the biggest body of the book is a remarkable set of elegies, which stand, I think, next to any great elegy written at any time, which is an achievement that you really wouldn't think was possible. They're utterly modern, but again in this kind of unobtrusive, non-showy, non-clever way, really, although very, very wise, and very, very traditional. I wonder whether we could sort of say something about that whole AZ, like there's one letter, isn't there, where four of his friends die in 1 month.
Yeah. Sorry, what do you want me to say?
Yeah, I don't know, I just rambling. I do that. Can you say anything about how did you talking to Tom about that time?
Yeah.
How was he around? I mean, it's sort of...
Well, I did actually see him in California during that period, but on the whole, I wasn't with him really, and so in that sense I don't know. I can only judge as you do by the letters. Clearly it was the most grim time.
Yeah.
And I think this sort of connects up with a lot of what we said about his character already. It was probably the worst moment of his life, apart from the death of his mother.
Right.
And he turned it into his best poetry. He had this extraordinary capacity to sort of take life and transform it in that way. But while being completely honest to the experience. That's my feeling about it. And I agree, I think they're an absolutely amazing set of poems. Do you want me to read one of those?
We will in a moment. Let's talk a bit more about AIDS first, because I'm old enough to remember that the adverts on BBC of all these collapsing gravestones, and you will get. I mean, it's a terrible time. For me, a gay man myself, it created a lot of awful sort of fear. There was fear everywhere. It changed the whole world for gay men. Suddenly, I remember going to have an AIDS test, and at that time it was, if you got it, you will be dead, and dead horribly. Gunn comes across in the letters as being extraordinarily kind to his friends, very ungrudging, very, very genuinely helpful. I don't know what happened. Perhaps Michael, you might say something about that time.
Yeah, so I think so when the subject of Lament is Alan Noseworthy, who Gunn knew from New York. He was a doorman at a leather bar on Christopher Street, and they sort of struck up a sort of a 10-year friendship. And Alan was really Tom's first-hand experience of AIDS. So even this is sort of April, May 1984. So still early, but not very, very, very early. So he was aware of it. They were closing some of the bathhouses in San Francisco. So he was aware of it. But there's this. Alan was living in Palm Springs, and he phoned Gunn and said, you know, I have Kaposi sarcoma. He had to come to San Francisco for what a treatment there was, and Gunn immediately says, come and stay with us. And there's this awful bit in the notebooks where Gunn is reflecting on sort of Alan maybe having like 1 to 5 years left, and like it's just awful, like, because he lasts maybe 2 months. And I think that kind of was the big. He describes it in the poem and as well as the notebook as well, about sort of going through a tunnel really fast and then suddenly stopping in his yard after his friend had died, and it must have been sort of awful, and you know, and the fear of perhaps him having it as well and not knowing, and you know, he says, I have 5. I think he said. So he's what is he 55 at this point? So he's like, I'm going to have like 5 to 20 years, and Alan has 1 to 5, and you know.
So I thought what we'd do, unless you want to say anything more.
No, you go on.
I thought what we might do is, because I thought it'd be really good to finish with this great poem, Lament. It's a long poem in exquisite rhyming couplets. You know, the elegy is often written in couplets. It's like a funeral march. Each rhyme just takes you forward 1 step. You know, like the funeral march in a way. And again, in this poem, you get this incredible objectivity. I mean, I remember reading it on a solitary retreat I was on, and I just, you know, it sort of broke my heart. I just wept and wept. Really, it's so deeply emotional, but the emotion is so carefully and objectively and scrupulously written about, without any sentimentality at all, without any self-pity, or, you know, it doesn't refer back to himself. It's a wonderful portrait of a man.
Yeah. Do you want me to read that?
Why don't we finish with you reading it? I'd love to, you know, take Thom to midnight, but you probably want to go home. So let's. It's quite a long poem, but you know, it's one of the very, very remarkable poems of Tom Gunn.
It's quite difficult to read, so forgive me if I stumble a bit. It's, Lament. Your dying was a difficult enterprise. First, petty things took up your energies, the small but clustering duties of the sick, irritant as the cough's dry rhetoric. Those hours of waiting for pills, shot, X-ray, or test, while you read novels 2 a day, already with a kind of clumsy stealth, distance you from the habits of your health. In hope still, courteous still, but tired and thin, you tried to say the man that you had been, treating each symptom as a mere mishap without import. But then the spinal tap. It brought a hard headache, and when night came, I heard you wake up from the same bad dream every half hour with the same short cry of mild outrage, before immediately slipping into the nightmare once again, empty of content but the drip of pain. No respite followed, though the nightmare ceased. No respite followed. Though the nightmare ceased, your cough grew thick and rich, its strength increased. 4 nights, and on the 5th, we drove you down to the emergency room. That frown, I'd never seen such rage in you before, as when they wheeled you through the swinging door. For you knew rightly they conveyed you from those normal pleasures of the sun's kingdom the hedonistic body basks within and takes for granted. Summer on the skin, sleep without break, the moderate taste of tea in a dry mouth. You had gone on from me, as if your body sought out martyrdom in the far Canada of a hospital room. Once there, you entered fully the distress and long pale rigours of the wilderness. A gust of morphine hid you. Back in sight, you breathed through a segmented tube, fat, white, jammed down your throat so that you could not speak. How thin the distance made you. In your cheek one day appeared the true shape of your bone, no longer padded. Still your mind alone explored this emptying intermediate state, for holes and rests were hidden in it. You wrote us messages on a pad, amused at one time that you had your nurse confused, who, seeing you reconciled after 4 years with your grey father, both of you in tears, asked if this was at last your special friend, the one you waited for until the end. She sings, you wrote, a Philippine folk song to wake me in the morning. It is long and very pretty. Grabbing at detail to furnish this bare ledge torn by the gale on which you lay, bed restful as a knife, you tried hard to make of it a life thick with the complicating circumstance your thoughts might fasten on. It had been chance always till now that had filled up the moment with live specifics, your hilarious comment discovered as it went along, and fed, laconic, quick, wherever it was led. You improvised upon your own delight. I think back to the scented summer night we talked between our sleeping bags below a molten field of stars 5 years ago. I was so tickled by your mind's light touch. I couldn't sleep, you made me laugh too much, though I was tired and begged you to leave off. Now you were tired, and yet not tired enough. Still hungry for the great world you were losing, steadily, in no season of your choosing. And when at last the whole death was assured, drugs having failed, and when you had endured 2 weeks of an abominable constraint, you faced it equably, without complaint, unwhimpering, but not at peace with it. You lived as if your time was infinite. You were not ready and not reconciled, feeling as uncompleted as a child, till you had shown the world what you could do in some ambitious role to be worked through, a role your need for it had half defined, but never wholly, even in your mind. You lacked the necessary ruthlessness, the soaring meanness that pinpoints success. We loved that lack of self-love, and your smile, rueful at your own silliness. Meanwhile, your lungs collapsed, and the machine unstrained, did all your breathing now. Nothing remained but death by drowning on an inland sea of your own fluids, which it seemed could be kindly forestalled by drugs, both could and would. Nothing was said, everything understood, at least by us. Your own concerns were not long-term precisely when they gave the shot. You made local arrangements to the bed and pulled the pillow round beside your head. And so you slept and died, your skin gone grey, achieving your completeness, in a way. Outdoors next day, I was dizzy from a sense of being ejected with some violence from vigil in a white and distant spot where I was none, into this garden plot, too warm, too close, and not enough like pain. I was delivered into time again. The variations that I live among where your long body too used to belong, and where the still bush is minutely active. You never thought your body was attractive, though others did, and yet you trusted it, and must have loved its fickleness a bit, since it was yours and gave you what it could, till near the end it let you down for good, its blood hospitable to those guests who took over by betraying it into the greatest of its inconsistencies. This difficult, tedious, painful enterprise.
That's a great place to finish, thank you.